And then I'm just inviting you to ask yourself, how are you right now? What are 2 or 3 words that might come up? I'm feeling a little breathless and excited about what's to come. And what are you bringing into this conversation? What are your intentions for this 2.5 hours together? How do you want to show up with yourself and with one another? And of course, because we want to invite all of ourselves into the room, what part of you doesn't want to be here? So just take a minute with those questions, and if you're willing to, share some of them in the chat box.
As those come to you, feel free to keep sharing those. I'll move on to the next slide. And these are some of the assumptions that we have coming into this conversation, or things that help me feel grounded when I do this. So the first is that we live in a world that is not neutral. There are inequitable systems of power that privilege some and marginalize others. Even though this is an anti-racism workshop, we talk mostly about power, because one of the assumptions that we have is that systems of power operate in similar ways, whether it's around race, gender, sexuality, or a number of different identities. We also know that we have assumed considerable misinformation about ourselves and about others, which we have internalized, impacting our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We need to unlearn oppressive attitudes and behaviors, and this is a lifelong journey. Resistance, denial, and pain are part of the work of healing and learning to connect across difference. People often describe this time as a period of birth, and during birth there are moments of contraction and expansion, of pain and ease, and this is the moment that we find ourselves in. There's no perfection in this work. Even reading through some of the questions that are coming up in the terminology, the vocabulary lists that we send out aren't perfect. They are always in need of updating. They are always in further need of work. And we acknowledge the harm that it does when we're not perfect and when we don't show up in the ways that we need to. And at the same time, we hold ourselves with the compassion needed to know that we're going to keep trying and we won't be able to get it right every time. Building social, economic, environmental justice requires systemic awareness. And we see all of these things as interconnected. There's no separation between what is racial justice and what is environmental justice. These are one and the same. And unless we're able to expand our view and see the systems that arise, it's very easy for us to turn on one another and be separated in our causes instead of joining together to form powerful working relationships and living relationships. Working together makes these things happen, and how we work together is crucial. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll be able to develop some tools that will allow us to think through how we work together and how we work with ourselves. So here's some of the goals that we have and some of the unfolding of what we'll be experiencing together over the next little bit. So we'll be presenting to you a power framework, and the intention behind this is to develop a shared language. I think I've been in a few circles where we seem to get racial justice right, and then gender justice becomes an issue. And gender justice gets solved, and then there's an ableism question that arises. So rather than trying to deal with a specific topic, we want to provide a broad framework that we can use to understand how power shows up. Knowing that we're going to follow these sessions with one specifically on anti-Black racism and one on anti-Indigenous racism, we hope that the language that we share will be helpful in navigating those conversations as well as others into the future. We'll take a break, and then we'll go through some of the terminology questions that we have. And depending on the time that we have, we might get into some of these tensions that we hold in settlement work. I believe that the reading was sent out, but was inaccessible to some people. So we may have to follow that up in a separate conversation that we have. So
I'm going to introduce this power framework. Aslam and I are going to go back and forth here. And I want to acknowledge the work of Arnie Mindell and Julie Diamond from the Process Work Institute, based out of Oregon, who've given us the bones of this power framework with which we work. So power is neither good nor bad. Power is an energy and a force. So we don't just see power when we see nations in conflict or see people on the streets facing police lines. We also see power when babies are born and when mushrooms push themselves up out of the soil. Power is everywhere in life, and it's an expression of life, energy, and force. So the definition that we are working with is power is a very general definition. Power is the access or the ability to get one wants, to get what one needs or wants through influence, impact on others, controls that we have of various sorts, and force often is what we see. Power isn't something to not address. In fact, it's vital for everybody to have it. And it can be, in the right hands and in the right ways, an incredibly creative force. And it is a creative force in the natural world and in so much of human interaction. The key is how it's used, because all power can be used and all power can be abused. And in the huge global disparities that we see every day that have just been made even more stark by the pandemic, those global disparities highlight the degree to which power inequities do exist. And the last thing, and this is very intro part that I want to say, is that power, when we think about it as something that we have for ourselves, is difficult to master. And it can't be mastered without managing our emotions. So a little more on that, and we go to the next slide. Well, actually, a slide or two. So we're using two general categories of the way that we talk about power. The first is personal power. So I'm starting on the right-hand side here. That inner and self-sourced sense of authority that remains stable and durable, or relatively durable, regardless of outer situations and circumstances. And this is a loose definition of personal power, and I want to stress from the beginning that all forms of power interact with other forms of power. They don't stand alone. But first, the personal power, and secondly, social power, which is externally given power. It's an outsourced sense of authority that's enforced through practices, institutions, and force, and it may shift depending on context. So the social power is what we refer to when we're talking about all of the systems of oppression that marginalize the many and privilege the few. But we're going to start with the personal power because it's the part of power that we tend to not actually pay a lot of attention to. So just before I go into this, the personal a little bit more, I'm just showing you a little more expanded version of this power framework that we use. So in the personal realm, that self-sourced power, there's the spiritual and the psychological. And then in the social realm, the externally imposed power relations are the global and the local. So I'm going to take you through the social and the spiritual and the psychological, and then Aslam will take you through the global and the local. And we will have small breakout groups in each of these sectors. Looking at together the psychological and spiritual powers, they're personal and individual sources of power. They're innate and developed. And what I mean by that is that some of these powers that we have that are psychological and maybe even spiritual, I'm not so sure about that one, still learning, but certainly the psychological, they're innate. Sometimes we're born with them. We have certain capacities, certain traits that we inherit from our ancestors, or that we learn very early on in our childhood. But many of our powers, psychological and spiritual, are developed. They build on those capacities that were born or we learn early. And they're extremely critical assets because they sustain us. They help us resist harmful exercises of power that completely constrain our lives. They help us find the energy and the wherewithal for organizing for change. They help us when things get tough, when we suffer defeats. And particularly when we have low social power, low power that comes from being marginalized by the social systems that Aslan will be talking about, it's really crucial to develop these psychological and spiritual powers, and often we see those emerge. But the process of them emerging requires internal work and healing, which is a lifelong process. And then it's also true that if we come from marginalized communities, which many of us do, it's also very difficult to access the resources to develop these psychological and spiritual powers. So it's a combination. Often when we are faced with the most difficult challenges because of our lack of power, we actually find the psychological and the spiritual, but we also are challenged with being able to develop it because of the limits to the resources that we can access. We can move on to the next part. So a little bit more on those two powers, spiritual and psychological. The first, the spiritual, is sourced from our connection to something greater than or bigger than our individual selves, often to something transcendent. And that connection can be to ancestors, to future beings, to some spiritual being for whom we feel we owe allegiance, to the natural world. It can be to any source. There are many different sources that people have from which they draw their spiritual power. It's often expressed as a deep sense of life's purpose, a kind of existential groundedness that is our anchor and our compass no matter what we face. And it can be expressed as an ability to hold different perspectives with empathy and compassion. We often use the example of Nelson Mandela, but with good reasons, because he could, with absolute situations where he had absolutely no social power, show both a profound spiritual and psychological power that enabled him to hold his movement for liberation in the same hands as he could hold the humanity of the guards that cared for him or didn't care for him. And my final point about spiritual power is because people often connect it directly with religious inspiration. It may not be specifically religious necessarily, but our faith can be, and is for many people, a source of our power. So now looking at psychological power, which is unique for all of us. Each person is unique in the combination of interpersonal skills, personality, traits, our life experience, our emotional intelligence, and our self-development. Nobody else has the same story as us or the same particular combination of traits. But when our psychological power is strong, we have wisdom and self-confidence, we have insight into ourselves and others, we're comfortable with emotions, both others and our own, and we're skilled, or at least we're learning to be skilled at managing our own. We're fluid, so we're not feeling the need to hold tight onto ways of doing things. We're not drawn to being static and rigid, but we're actually open to the flow of possibilities that happens between people. We're able to get along with people, to be open, and to respond to conflict effectively. So, we can be in a situation where when faced with conflict, if we have high psychological power, especially in terms of our emotional intelligence, then we will be open to that conflict. In fact, we may welcome it as a creative force, and we open to other folks expressing their strong feelings, and we're flexible in responding and welcoming those feelings. If our psychological power is low in that area of emotional intelligence, we're going to probably shut down emotions. We're not going to want to go there. And we may use our power to override other people's emotions and experience. So our psychological power, like all powers, can be high or low, depending on not only what we come with in our life, but also the way in which we've learned to develop that power over time. So I think are we on to the next slide? Oh yes, just before we do, I'm going to just share with you a quick example from myself, personal example of that having strong psychological powers and areas where one is not as strong, which is some of my character traits is I've got a lot of confidence, I'm a risk taker, I have a really strong drive to understand, to know the world and to know myself. And those powers have served me well as a woman, but also as a white person, a middle-class person making my way. However, when I'm forced and faced with my privilege, my comfort, and the ease which I derive from my social power, I may struggle to see the truth of how this perpetuates harm. And part of the reason why I struggle is because I have a certain image of myself. I don't want to make mistakes. I want to be right, which is something that very much is connected to living as a white person in a society infused with white supremacy. But it also comes out of my personal story of being punished for making mistakes. So I struggle because my fear, which comes out of my early wounding, of being wrong and making mistakes, can hijack me and it can kick me off my ground. And that's when I use my other psychological powers, the willingness to take risks, to be vulnerable, to open myself to not knowing, even though I desperately want to be right, to let myself say, okay, yeah, you don't know and you have to learn, and to let those powers, the stronger powers, support me as I deal with the areas in which I'm challenged and need to do some good, important learning. So I'm using that as an example of the way our psychological powers can be both strong and weak, and the way that we can develop them. So I want to just stress psychological power, part of it is born with, but it's also something that we develop over time. So we're now going to take you into talking about your personal powers, your spiritual and your psychological. So here's the question to you. Questions in your pairs. First of all, though, we want you to reflect for 3 minutes. So just a little time to get yourself centered. What are your psychological and spiritual powers? This may not be something you've spent a lot of time thinking about, so it's something to honor. And where or how do you build or access these powers, the source of these powers for you?
Local power is around really like seniority and position. So the way that I like to think about local power is when you're in a room, who has the power to shape the culture, who has the power to determine the topics of conversation, who feels a great sense of belonging in that space. So there's lots of different examples you can think about, whether it's in your home life, whether it's in your office spaces, whether it's on sports teams or in a building strata meeting or something like grocery store. When you're interacting with someone, there's always a local power dynamic at play. And quite often this is dependent on some of the global power, right? Race, class, gender. But it's also local in the sense that it could come from seniority, it could come from position, or it could come from how long you've been in a space and what that means for your sense of belonging and ease, because you understand the culture, you understand the language. The work that all of you do with LEPS, this shows up quite particularly because I think a lot of newcomers are trying to figure out how to fit into Canada. And what they're trying to do is like learn what are the local power dynamics and where they fit within that. So I see Jessie is able to share the slides. So if you can go into presentation mode and just share the slide that comes before that one. Thanks. Yeah, so these are this is how local power operates, and it shifts depending on the context, and it can shift quite rapidly. So if I'm in a room with some coworkers and all of a sudden the boss walks in or the director walks in, you'll notice the shift and change in how conversation happens, how people behave, what values and communication styles become apparent in those moments. Again, the reminder that like having local power is neutral, but it depends how you use it or misuse it. So if you're in a space where you're interacting with people who don't have a lot of local power, do you use your power to help them center their voices, or do you use your local power to exclude and make them feel othered and marginalized? there's also like local power comes into play a lot when we think about code switching. So this is when particularly minority groups have to learn the dominant way of interacting. I remember like growing up, I went to a school that was white dominant. I had to show interest in things that I had no interest in. And I had to silence parts of myself because it was not acceptable in that space. And then I would go back home and then I would have to shift who I was completely. So then the person that I was in conflict with the person at home and at school. So I think this is something to be aware of, especially when we're working with newcomers, immigrants, that what are the local power dynamics at play, and how are people being asked to assimilate or to fit in. We're going to ask you to reflect more on your own local power. So where is it? If we can go to the next slide, please, Jesse. Where is it and in what contexts do you have high local power? And where or in what contexts do you not have that high positional power? So once again, we'll give you a few minutes to reflect on that, and then we'll put you into breakout rooms to share, this time just for 8 minutes. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to share them here or in the Miro board that we have for local power. And welcome back, everyone. A reminder, if you are having challenges with the Miro board, you can just send me a message either privately or send a message in the group and I'll add it to the board on your behalf. Or we'll just address it when we address all the questions at the end. Thanks again for your patience as we figure out all of the breakout sessions. I think I just had it figured out with Zoom and now we're trying WebEx for the first time. So there's always learning to happen. Jackie?
Yeah, so just again, a little bit of movement. I'm going to, I don't know if you can put me on, take the slide off for a minute. Anyway, so I'm going to suggest, first of all, you rub your hands together and really get some heat going between them. And then one of the things I like to do is just put them on the sides of my face to feel the warmth of my hands and actually be a little nice to my jaw, which has probably got a little tight. And I see as I'm standing up, that's even better. And then take your hands and lace your fingers together and turn them inside out and give yourself a good stretch. And then raise them above your head if you can, if that's accessible to you, and then let them come down. And just give some roll to those shoulders forward and back to them. Your body spends so much time sitting in front of computers. My body just, okay, and then shake your hands out. Just shake out the energy. Okay, back to you, Aswell.
Thanks. And Jesse, if you can share the next slide, please. So we started off looking at personal power, and now we're looking at the social power, and we started with spiritual and psychological and local. And now I think this is kind of like the juice of anti-racism work, if that's what people were like really waiting for. They're like, what is all of this like hippie emotional stuff? Like, here's the anti-racism, the global power piece. So global power, the first thing to say about it is that it's context dependent. So I mentioned that I'm from South Africa, and being brown skinned in South Africa actually carries a relative amount of privilege. And then coming over to Canada, I realized that that same level of ease that I walked around the world with was no longer there. Suddenly I was more racialized in this new context. But it's also seemingly static. And we say seemingly because it takes a long time to shift some of these patterns and dynamics of power. It's often associated with a societal ideal derived from historic and current patterns of domination and control. So if we think about who is and who is not the cisgender, married, adult, white male, who's able-bodied, there's almost like an ideal human that systems are designed to cater towards. And if you fall anywhere outside of that, then there are systems that are designed to make life less easy for you, that make it more difficult for you to see yourself represented in places of decision making, in places of power, even just on screens and in magazines and that type of thing, because the world is designed, or the systems are designed towards a specific ideal, and there's patterns of domination and control that reinforce that. The global power, sometimes when we present this model, people will think about, spiritual and psychological, and use that to minimize the importance of the global. Often marginalized people will be told, oh, you just need to be more perseverant, or you just need to try harder, or, if you were more resilient, or if you believed in yourself more, then you wouldn't have all of these problems in your life. And this is one of the greater injustices, because the global power dynamics and systems have the biggest impact on people's lives to their ability to pursue and realize their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations, and live the types of lives that they want to live. And how are these global patterns sustained? They're sustained through stereotypes, bias, privilege, institutions. In the terminology sheet, one of the things that came up was the difference between systemic and institutional racism, and largely these things operate in similar ways. It's just at different scales. On the next slide, please. So here is the list of identity categories that we work with. I think sometimes when people start engaging in anti-oppression work, it feels inexhaustible, like there's so many fights to fight and there's so many injustices in the world, and where do I even begin? Well, we use this as a way to kind of just lay out what are the main identity categories that are systemically reinforced to privilege some and not privilege others, or to oppress others. And as we look at this chart, we'll give you a second to fill it in for yourself. But it's worth trying to draw attention to just a couple of things that we say that some of these groups are context dependent. So age is an example, right? So there's a privileged group in North American Western society, which is adults and young adults. The not privileged group are children, adolescents, and elders. And the system that reinforces this is a system called ageism, which we can break up into, how does it operate, what it operates through, the way that we show respect, the way that we show representation, a number of other dynamics. But, in other cultures, in other communities, elders are revered, and it's more privileged to be an elder in certain contexts. But this table over here is presenting the dominant North American context. So ability, sometimes we talk about temporarily abled persons or currently abled persons, acknowledging that many of us are very close to living with a disability at any time. Cisgender men being the privileged group amongst the gender category. Race and ethnicity we can comment on a little bit more. And this is because of the creation of whiteness. So the same way that all racial categories are socially constructed, introduced at a specific historical moment and then added to and reinforced over time, whiteness in particular is something that people very rarely question. How does one become white? What was the historical process that created whiteness? And when we look back at North American history, we can see that the category of whiteness has expanded and contracted at different times. So at one point, Italians were not considered white. And then when it became more politically and economically convenient for the dominant class to have Italians classified as white, then they became known and accepted as white. An interesting example is Arab people of Arabian descent, with numerous legal cases outlining when people of Arab descent are considered white, and then when it became less politically convenient, then they were reclassified as not white. There were some questions around like indigenous, Black, racialized people, and this term people of color. And I just want to speak to some of the the complexity and the challenge with language, that even the term people of color, or sometimes we use BIPOC or IBPOC, Indigenous Black people of color, the people of color term tends to homogenize a group. So it doesn't take into account the full complexity of experiences. It doesn't help us address some of these intersectionalities. So the way that women of color are treated in the workplace is so different from men of color's treatment. And when we do research or when we do surveys, if we're not taking an intersectional approach, then we're only listening for voices of people of color, but that might not be the full representation of voices of women of color. One of the systems that reinforces race and ethnicity is what we commonly refer to as white supremacy. And this is basically the idea that white people are better than. And how it realizes itself is that white ways of being are better than. So ways of being that privilege the written word over the spoken word, that value efficiency over relationships. These are, ideas that come from, post-Enlightenment European civilization that then, through processes of colonization, became seen as the standard that should be aspired towards, and really informs the way that most of our workplaces operate today, how our institutions are set up, how our understanding of what justice is and what justice looks like is all informed by white supremacy at its roots, which makes it, such a difficult thing to uproot and to question, because sometimes it's described as the water that we swim in. If we were fish swimming in a sea of white supremacy, you don't see the white supremacy around you because it's just everywhere that you look. I think some of the other ones that might be worth calling attention to, particularly because of the sectors that you work in, might be things like immigration status, or national origin. So because I'm South African born, I know what it is like to carry a Canadian passport versus carrying a different passport. If I think about just in recent conversations around people having to spend Christmas away from loved ones because of the pandemic and social distancing rules and the inability to travel, I just think about the number of stateless, precarious status, refugee, undocumented, immigrant refugee people who have had to spend many, many, many celebrations, holidays, weddings, birthdays, births, deaths away from their loved ones, because of these systems of imperialism that have created these borders and said some people can travel freely across them and other people can't. So this chart, so we'll provide the slides to everybody after the training. I'm just looking through the chat box quickly. We'll provide the slides for you afterwards, and we'll also give each of us a chance to examine these a little bit more closely, and to speak to some of our own examples. So on the next slide, I can just speak to some of the identities that I carry, and we'll ask you all to engage in a similar reflection exercise. So I'm an adult, able-bodied, cisgender man. So cisgender meaning that the sex that I'm assigned to at birth is the sex that I identify with, gender that I identify with. As I mentioned, the complexity of being brown, of being brown-skinned or of Indian descent. In South Africa, relative privilege, again, like compared to white people, not as privileged, but then in Canada, definitely not carrying that same amount of global power. Coming from a middle-class family, parents university educated, and myself having access to higher education, being heterosexual. And then the global category of power, when I'm Muslim, I'm targeted by that, right? So many of you will know the way that we experience airports. Cities are not designed to be friendly towards Muslim people. I can't hear the adhan, I can't go to the mosque, things that for me are like the basics of living out my spiritual obligations and my faith. But if we only have this view that has the global lens, then we're unable to see the strength and the resilience and the personal and spiritual power that people do gain from their faith identities. So sometimes people will say like, oh, if it's so hard to be a Muslim, why don't you just, convert or be something else or practice it in private, without seeing the complexity that comes from what it means to hold this identity in its fullness. Being non-Indigenous means that I'm a beneficiary of colonialism. On this land, I am a settler, and I stand in solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty because I think that's the path towards a decolonial future for all of us. And one of the questions was around pan-indigeneity, and I want to contrast this with Pan-Africanism. So pan-indigeneity and Pan-Africanism both oppose the way that colonialism sought power over Africans and Indigenous people. So in Africa, domination and control was exercised through dividing people and conquering them, by treating them all as separate, by stirring up tensions between different tribal groups. And that's why Pan-Africanism was a resistance movement that sought to find the similarities between African people to resist a common oppression. Pan-indigeneity is the opposite, because in many ways, oppression of Indigenous people has happened over here through a homogenization of what it means to be Indigenous. So all Indigenous people are treated the same, are seen as the same. Understandings of one Indigenous community are then expanded as if to include all Indigenous communities. A treaty signed with one Indigenous community is then applied to all the communities. So pan-indigeneity is a way that oppression is reinforced by homogenizing a very complex set of communal things. National origin, immigration status. So because I've got Canadian and South African citizenship, I carry a lot of global power in that sense. And then the final one, I think this is largely thanks to Jackie that I've improved my understanding of what it means to be human in a world that centers the human experience through extractive economies and anthropocentrism in our decision-making, that we then become privileged over the non-human or the beyond humans. I find this beneficial because it also helps us get out of, sometimes we get trapped in our oppression when that's the only category that we see, without realizing the ways that we do have some privilege. And for me personally, it's helped me understand the journey of unpacking one's whiteness because of the challenges that I've had in unpacking my maleness and my masculinity. So, I can easily and happily tell white people, stop being so defensive, and why must you make this about you? And I'm just telling you how to be more just in the world. And then when women tell me the same thing, I get defensive and I put up all of my barriers, and I just shut down and become numb and become unable to hear. So this has helped me kind of navigate some of the complexities around that space for myself. Yeah, the next slide, please, Jessie, and Jackie will share some of her experience.
Actually, I suggest, Aslam, that people can look at it quickly, but I not speak to it and allow people to fill out their own in the interest of time.
So on the next slide, there's a blank sheet. So we did send this to you ahead of time. So maybe it's not there. Okay, maybe we can just go back to slide 21. So the one that's completely filled out. So we sent ahead of time to everybody a blank sheet, and we're going to ask you to spend a few minutes just filling in where do you fit within these, what are the identities that you hold, and also acknowledging the complexities that all of us have that aren't perfectly captured by some of these binaries that exist. So if you don't have that sheet that was sent to you ahead of time, just feel free to copy down what this table looks like, at least the headers, and then fill it out for yourself. And we'll have 3 minutes to reflect on your global power, and then we'll move into a third sharing activity once again. And I will share the link to the Miro slides where you can share your reflections and questions. There's a few questions that came up, particularly with the personal and with the global as well. So the questions around, let me switch my view as well so I can see a few more faces. So one of the questions or comments that was made about the importance of recharging, because it's harder to be empathetic when burnt out. And this does relate to another question that was shared around, there we go, how do we do anti-racism work? And this is why we started with the personal power, because to fight against unjust systems, to create more space for justice in the world, requires us to be quite centered, requires us to not be burnt out, so that we're able to engage in more empathy. And the recharging often for people comes through the spiritual power. So by getting out into nature, through having time and making time for prayer, various other activities that we engage in that help us to recharge and reconnect with our center and with our core, then give us a different type of recharging compared to just going on a holiday. It actually gives us the type of recharge and recentering that helps us build our empathy to be able to engage with other folks. I'll just make whatever comments I have on these, and then I'll pass over to Jackie to add anything. So the next thing, like passing on spiritual and psychological power to others, is something like I really have seen happening, that strong leaders are the ones who have really good spiritual and psychological power and grounding that they are then able to use in order to create more space for others to engage in ways of being that are less extractive and exhaustive. And this also happens a lot within families and within communities, where certain people are the ones that you will turn to for help and for guidance, because you know that they have the spiritual and psychological power that might be able to help and assist you. We do want to make sure that this is understood, that like spiritual and psychological power can be abused, and this happens often, especially within religious communities. A lot of like manipulation that happens is done by people who have a lot of spiritual and psychological power. Sorry, I should say psychological power because of their understanding of human emotion. Spiritual power, I think less so. When I think about religious abuse, it's people who have local power, who have high positions of authority, but aren't necessarily grounded in their own spiritual practice and their own ways of seeing themselves. And then the third point on this was that disempowerment can, in personal power, can make itself apparent through force. And when I think the surrounding comment around this was that when people don't have a strong sense of groundedness, a strong sense of who they are, it's quite possible that they try to compensate for that through taking up more space in a room, making sure that their voice is heard, enforcing their beliefs on others, as a way of like kind of compensating for some of that insecurity. And then on the global, I do want to acknowledge that the system, the way that it presents itself, doesn't paint a full picture. I think the full picture is something that we're always striving to get to. It is a binary system that does do away with some of the complexity and the nuance. And one of the nuances that I've seen coming up is around, what does it mean to be mixed race? So if you're mixed race, the system treats you quite differently depending on how you appear, right? So in terms of your appearance, you could be read as white. So people see you as a white person and then treat you in a certain way, or you could be read as racialized, in which case you're seen and treated in a certain way. So that's how like the global systems impact you. But there's a whole other side of it, which is the personal, especially psychological systems or power dynamics. And I've seen a lot of mixed race people in particular have high levels of psychological power because they've been able to tap into empathy with white parents and racialized parents, white families and racialized families. And in some ways, they become bridge builders. They become edge walkers, people who can step in and out of these different worlds. I think a lot about Trevor Noah as a mixed race person from South Africa. He is able to connect with people from a multitude of different backgrounds. And it's precisely because he doesn't necessarily fit into this binary. sometimes he is read in certain ways, other times he's not. So he kind of has a greater understanding of that, the nuance of this experience. And then the last question that I'll comment on is, yeah, again, this, like, one of the challenges of this model is it can't hold all the complexity. So, for example, depending on the space that you're in and the time that you're in, to be a cultural Christian is quite accepted. But then you could be in, a very strong Christian dominated, I'm thinking about like the Bible Belt of the United States, and to be culturally Christian is not enough. You might be targeted because of that. And then in other parts of the world, I think about university spaces in particular, to be someone who holds any sort of faith identity means that you're targeted. And really, it's like people who are agnostic or atheist who are more privileged in that space. So this is where the contextualization of global power does come into play. Mm-hmm. Jackie, did you want to add anything to these particular points?
Just briefly, thanks, Aslam. Wanted to come back on the psychological power a little bit, just to add a couple of comments. First, on the importance of recharging. Just to also note that when we're tired and exhausted, our psychological power decreases. Then we default to kind of more what I would call limbic system responses to situations. So yes, it's important to recharge, and it actually has a huge impact on our ability to show up with the fullness of our psychological powers. And then on the thing about insecurity or disempowerment often expressing itself as force, and Aslam, I think you used the word about people exercising it because of their insecurity. It always strikes me as important, and I'm not sure where the origin of this question comes from, but to first of all, to acknowledge, depending on what you mean by force, that there is legitimate anger, that marginalized communities of all sorts have powerful anger, and that may come across sometimes as an expression of force, but it's actually a necessary expression of power from a situation where people are struggling to readjust the power balances. And then I also like to think about, what is it that causes white people to hold on so tight to white supremacy? And I think that's a deep, deep, deep insecurity. It is a looking for power by using the global power without the psychological power, the kind of constructive psychological power that we're talking about. And so I think there's a compensation for that insecurity, which expresses itself in all of the very forceful ways that white people have kept their control. And that's all I need to say on that, Aslam. Maybe you might like to add to what I've just said, because we don't always see things the same way.
No, I really appreciate what you said about how anger can then be expressed through force, especially when it's not listened to. And there's like a huge legitimacy within that. I think about every freedom fighter and every struggle for liberation is coming from that. And then on the other side, I do see oppressive force coming from those who have power, which is why it's important to like look at who has power and how it's being exercised. And I think this is where like modern narratives around the disempowerment of white people in the United States used as a narrative by those in power to kind of like reinforce white supremacy. And it's a really difficult thing to grapple with. Like, where do these narratives come from? How do they get embedded in people? Also, like, how do we like show people like and debunk the myth of it, right? Like, how do we debunk the fact that like you're not actually losing your jobs to immigrants, and there's a whole bunch of things that come along with that. Mm-hmm. And then just one more point that came out that I hadn't seen when I put the slide up was someone saying that it's hard to recognize any self non-privileges because of the white privilege guilt I carry. And when we engage in anti-racism work, especially for people in positions of power, guilt, shame are amongst the most harmful things, because it stops us from moving. and it stops us from actually helping change the situation because we get trapped within this. And I've been having conversations with some folks recently about books like White Fragility and what Robin DiAngelo writes about. That in one sense, like, yes, it's good to acknowledge the multiple ways that white people are privileged in society. But if it only leaves you feeling guilty and shameful and stops you from acting, it's not that helpful. Like, it doesn't help me as a racialized person if you're feeling guilty and shame. But how do we move beyond that? And we're trying to introduce like an ethic of care. So it's not about like, okay, I feel guilty because I've got these privileges that are unearned. Like, yes, that's true. But more so, do you care about people who are having, for want of a better word, a shitty experience in their day-to-day lives? And if you care about that person, the people in your workplace, the people in your community, if you care for them, it's not the guilt and the shame that's going to help you to help them. It's actually the care and the love that you have for them that's going to help you to move into a space beyond guilt and shame where you can actually engage in helpful ways.
And maybe I can just add one thing to that, in agreement with all of that Absalom says about how guilt and shame are not useful, and that our care and our compassion and our desire for connection can help us move. And I also think, and that's why I tried to give that example for myself, we have work to do from our positions of power and privilege. We have internal emotional work to do. So shame and guilt are, they don't come from nowhere. They're actually rooted in how we learn to be the particular humans that we are. So it is important to spend time with where does that shame and guilt come from? And how does it grab you in such a way that it actually turns you back towards yourself rather than outwards in the way that Aslan was talking?
Oh yeah, it's like my total like male supremacy that when my wife calls me out on something, I feel guilty about, oh, why didn't I behave better, and why, instead of making it about her experience, I make it totally about my experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And then we'll speak to some of the questions that came up from the terminology Miro board. So Tracy, if you can just go, I think it's probably 3 slides down. Oh, here we go. Jackie, do you want to take the first crack at these?
Yes, actually it sort of flows out of what we were just talking about. I'm going to take, first of all, intent versus impact, because it was, I have to say, in my own journey, a big one for me. And I'm sure that probably all of us at some level can identify with that phrase. That's not what I meant. I did not mean that. That was not my intention. It's kind of a gut first response. And in navigating across power differences, it's probably the very least useful thing that anybody can say. Now, you may be feeling it. You may be feeling like, well, I didn't really mean to be hurtful, but really, in the end, it doesn't really so much matter, because the impact of your words was hurtful for somebody. And so the work from our places of privilege, whether it's around race or gender or sexuality or sexual orientation or wherever it is to really ground yourself in trying to find out what was the impact with the other person. So over the years, I've learned to totally bite my intent, because if I go into my intent, it's centering it again on me, just as we were just talking, and to try to really find out what is the impact. And then when I understand that impact, to try in whatever ways I can to show that I understand it and to check it out, because maybe I don't really understand it. I think I do. And if the person is willing to really give me the explanation of the impact and to clarify, then that really helps. And I leave it to the other person, the person who I've harmed, to let me know if they're interested in my intent. And if they're not, I deal with that on my own or with other folks. So I'll just say that one, and then maybe I'll talk briefly about a safe space, and then we'll go back and forth, Aslam.
Yep.
How to create a safe space. So Aslam and I and others in this organization that we're part of, called the Interactivists, spend 5-day sessions trying to create safe spaces, but we actually don't, we try to nuance this. So what we would prefer to say is we want to create brave spaces, because it's actually not possible to, if we bring into a room people who have dominant, marginalized identities, and then people who have more dominant identities in the room, we're going to end up with people feeling unsafe because the power differences are there in the room. So what we try to do is to support people and make it as safe as we can, but to ask people to be brave. And that's about sitting with the discomfort, sitting with the challenges that are put to you, and trying to work through them both internally and with the person who's challenging you. So that's a part of a very long conversation on how we try to do that. But we say brave spaces rather than safe spaces. And over to you, Aslam, on my points. Or?
Yeah, I think, it's one of the terms that gained a lot of popularity very quickly, this idea of safe space. And I think safe spaces for me are usually spaces where people of a marginalized identity can gather with one another. Mm-hmm. And even then, it can never be completely safe. There's always the chance of someone saying or doing something that's going to do harm. It's always possible to happen. But the idea of safe space came about from, I think it was majority like Black women gathering with other Black women, where they could share their experiences and be in solidarity with one another. And that's a very important space. When we're trying to do anti-racism work, it's so important to help promote spaces where marginalized identities can gather with one another to help validate their experiences, support one another, not feel the need to change their tone and their language and make sure that, the dominant feels comfortable. It's a really important space to create and help to foster. And allow whatever comes out of that to come out of it without fear or anxiety that it's going to be against whatever your agenda is, because it's really about decentering your agenda and centering someone else's. When I look at these list of questions, it's impossible for us obviously to cover it all, and it just shows the complexity and how much work there is to do around this. Yes, I want to acknowledge there's so many terms that are left out of this list. I think the list was really long, and I think it needs to be added to. Two-spirit was left out, white supremacy was left out, Black was left out, non-binary was left out. And I'm sure that there's even more that we need to add to it. So this is a work in progress, and I thank you for the inputs that you've given, and I'll do my best to kind of add to it as we move forward. Then these questions around like cultural assimilation, and I think it's linked to internalized racism. So part of this 5-day course that we do with Interactivist goes through the different skill sets that people use when they are being targeted by a system. So sometimes the skills that we use are to assimilate, to survive, because that's what it takes. And if I can give an example from my own personal story, is like my grandfather would only speak English at home. He only wore 3-piece suits, and his aspiration was to be British. And he would be quite open about this, because there was so much power in the white identity and in the British identity that the only way to kind of move through the world safely was to fit into that as much as you could. And as a result of that, he carries internalized racism, because he started to hate people who didn't fit into that aspiration, because those people who then started posing a threat to him and what he was trying to achieve in the world. And often we see this as even more so between racialized groups, right? So the amount of anti-Black racism within Indian communities is really high. The amount of anti-Indigenous racism within South Asian communities is really high as well. And this is also perpetuated by these broader systems that kind of feed these stereotypes back into us, and also divide us and prevent us from building relationships between one another. So there's so few spaces in the city that I can go to and meet and interact and build relationships with Indigenous people. And as a result, my experience what messages I receive about who the communities are, who the people are, will be through what I consume in mass media. And a lot of that is laced with a lot of white supremacy within it.
Mm-hmm.
This question around like anti-oppression versus anti-racism and how and when do we use them? I think this is interesting, and this very webinar or discussion or workshop is an example of like, how do we navigate this, right? Sometimes I think it is useful to just focus on anti-racism, but I also think it's useful to get a broader perspective on how oppression works, how systems of oppression work, how power works, because as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes race is going to be the issue. Sometimes it's going to be gender. Sometimes it's going to be language. And if we have the skills to deal with oppression, then it makes it easier to deal with anti-racism and various others as they come up. Do you want to speak to colorblindness?
Sure. Well, you know, those of you who live in British Columbia, and if you don't, you may have heard about this, but when John Horgan, the leader of the NDP, was running in the last election, he was asked at the big debate among the leaders a question about race, and he says, "I don't see race. I used to play lacrosse with all kinds of Indigenous and people of color." So he got a big blast for that, and he did a very quick turnaround around it. So I guess my quick answer on this would be, there's a yearning very often for white people to make all of this go away by appealing to some higher sense of human unity, where everybody is the same and everybody's equal. And the reality in this world is not only is not everybody the same, but in this world, the diversity that we have is interlaced deeply with all of these structures of oppression and control. So to say I do not see color is actually, I believe, to be dishonest, because I think that everybody carries deep bias in terms of the way that they see one another around race. But not only I think it's dishonest, it's an actual denial of the experience of people of color in this society. So people that try to bring it into equity, diversity, and inclusion discussions pretty often are going to get the kind of response you just got from me about colorblindness. Even though I recognize the yearning for a more beautiful and perfect and inclusive world, we're far from it. And so we have to acknowledge what it means to be a person of color every day, every minute.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, even these words, diversity and inclusion, are like heavily critiqued, right? Diversity assumes that there's like a standard way and then everybody else is diverse. I've been in rooms where people are like giving a speech or something and then turn and face me directly because I'm the only racialized person there and say the word diversity, right? It's like, it's because that like, you know, we center the white experience so much, and inclusion as well is seen as like, you know, we will include you. So we have the power and we will use that power to bring you in. And I'm a lot more in favor of, you know, words like decolonization, anti-racism, anti-Black racism that name things as they are, rather than, you know, the kind of like softer words that help people kind of like scoot around the issue sometimes. But I mean, I also sit with the complexity of like, you know, these are the words that people are using, and how do we meet people where they're at?
Yeah. And actually, this is a good place to bring in the question about somebody saying terms may mean one thing and resonate another way. And the example is affirmative action. So, you know, there was a time, you know, in Canada, but especially in the United States, where affirmative action programs were seen as a way to try to create greater equity in workplaces. And as is often the case with all struggles for social justice, that phrase, that those programs and the phrase were picked up massively by the backlash against those programs. And the line that was promulgated by the backlash was, this means that people who are not qualified are getting put into positions of responsibility when they actually don't deserve it. And so affirmative action got a really bad rap because of the power of that backlash. And so you don't hear that phrase used as much now, and you hear much more the ones that Aslam was just talking about, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion, which are more the current flavor, which challenges people to look at not just equity, but what that means in terms of diversity and inclusion. And what Aslam says about the problems with those terms is also true. So we're in a very vibrant, changing world around our understanding of how to make the changes for justice that we'd like to see. And the words and the frames are going to constantly change. So I don't know if that answers the point that somebody was making about resonating one way.
And I think maybe we can just use that to kind of try answer what I think is like the big question is, how do we support anti-racism work as LIP coordinators? And, you know, that in some ways is like the million-dollar question. And, you know, we are not going to have all of the answers. We don't know your contexts. And especially, you know, folks are joining from all over the country, and what's happening in Manitoba is going to be so different from what's happening in BC. It's going to be so different from what's happening elsewhere. I think some of the suggestions that we can share are kind of like entryways and invitations that feel free to take if you think it's helpful. But, you know, doing that personal work, you know, really thinking about that psychological power and the spiritual power. Because if you're not connected in those ways, it's going to be difficult for you to do work that doesn't keep perpetuating harm and perpetuating cycles. I think, you know, the learning process is ongoing and never ending for us as much as anyone else. So the more you're able to read and learn and engage, the better. And then for me, the third thing is like relationships. And, you know, if you have genuine, respectful, deep, caring relationships where people are willing to be honest with you, where people are willing to do emotional labor for you and walk you through in your own learning, compensate them if you can in any way possible, and be very grateful for those relationships, because most racialized people are doing this work off the side of their desks in their own time, carrying a lot of burden, and they need to be supported in so many ways, through spaces where they can support one another, through financial means and financial supports, and through their own education and training. I think it saddens me that a lot of equity, diversity, inclusion money gets spent on educating white people. Like it's kind of like the irony of the system is that like, oh, you don't have this knowledge, so we're going to pay to teach you, instead of the people who have this knowledge and understanding already being given more power and authority, and spaces to speak.
Which is trying to sort of hold a stance in the work that we do of both fierceness and gentleness when we can, because it's really important to be fierce and to be clear and to speak truth to power. And when we have the resources to do it with one another in a way that nurtures the possibilities for all of us being in the service of greater justice. But, you know, that it won't always happen. That gentleness won't always be there. So it's about learning how to sit in the fire, especially when we're called in about the ways in which our power and privilege shows up. So we'd like you to sort of end, and maybe you could use Aslam's words to inspire the little bit of reflection we're asking you to do. If you could, Jesse, just put on the last slide. But thinking in terms of going forward in the work that you're doing, just to reflect on a thought or an insight or a question that you're leaving with. But this is more the cognitive part of you. And then one feeling, or maybe there's a couple of feelings or emotions or body sensations you're noticing right now, in addition to perhaps that you're hungry or tired at the end of your day. And then we just asked for one action you want to either stop, start, or continue. I'm sure you could come up with a list of 10, but just choose one that can maybe be a little signpost that you can lean into over the next little while. And we'd appreciate if you're willing to share on your head, heart, and hands in the Miro board, those of you who can access it. Thank you. And because I think that some of you will probably start disappearing, I just really want to appreciate your going on this journey with us. And I think, and appreciating that some of the technical challenges have been challenging. We're learning, and turn over, I guess, the last bit to you there, Aslan, please.
Yeah, so I'll just say maybe I can do the next 2 slides, Jesse. So the upcoming sessions on January 15th, I think that's the tentative date, specifically looking at anti-Black racism. And then on January 25th with Marjorie Bucage, it's an Indigenous sharing circle. And then the last thing is to just share our contact information if anything is coming up for you, if you would like some further support. And I think there's a feedback form that will be sent to you as well. Please feel free to share any feedback you have with us. We'd really appreciate the opportunity for our own learning. And yeah, I think the rest of the time, if we can just spend in reflection together, would be really helpful. So if we can go back to the head, heart, hands, and then feel free to share any insights you have in that Miro board. And just to echo my gratitude to all of you for showing up and your patience with the technical issues. And also thank you to Jackie. I think it's really been lovely to co-facilitate. I speak about like the importance of co-facilitating cross-racially, something that I heard from an Indigenous teacher that I've got, Rain Daniels, who says a similar thing when she does this work. And it's been a pleasure working with you, and I continue to learn a lot from you, especially the journey that you're on, that I've been able to witness and walk alongside part of.